Live streaming is on.
Hello, Multiverse. My name is Gerry Fialka. It's January 3rd, 2021, and we are grateful to Clinton Ignatoff for facilitating and helping us today. I am going to interview Samuel R. Howard. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you, Samuel, today. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you very much.
First question is, do you go by Sam or Samuel? What do you prefer?
It depends. You can call me Sam if you prefer Sam. I was christened Samuel.
What do you?
We can go with Sam. It's one syllable, and my mother always used to call me Samuel when she was angry at me.
So yeah.
It's less traumatic.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you the whole story of Frank Zappa calling me Gerald instead of Gerry. But we'll go with this. Sam, what is the best thing for a human being?
Lots of water and lots of oxygen. And I think from a less pragmatic or a less utilitarian perspective, enough access to basic needs so that they can actually enjoy aesthetic pleasures in great abundance.
Very good. You are brief and articulate, and I agree with all those. What's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
It depends on the type of information I'm trying to learn. So if it's a practical piece of information, I like video, or I like it in front of me because that way I can interact with it and learn. If it's just something conceptual, I like to read. And if it's just for example, if we learn a piece of music or something, I can read music. I like the score, but I prefer to listen and to play that way.
And reading wise, did your parents read in front of you, tell you to read, or did you pick up reading on your own?
Well, my mother gave me a book called The Very Hungry Caterpillar when I was a small child. It's very intellectually stimulating. But no, yeah, they encouraged me to read. I think they wanted me to have a good level of literacy. See, I'm from the north of England, so we need whatever we can get over here.
Very good. On information, Sam, why do you think humans collect or gather information?
So just so we can navigate the world much more easily. Otherwise, we'd make no progress. If we didn't collect or record information, we wouldn't be able to share it with each other as easily. So we wouldn't be able to learn from each other, and we wouldn't be able to progress quite as well or quite as quickly.
Is this need or want to collect or gather information more innate in humans or more invented?
So the need and the sort of behavior is probably innate. I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, by the way, so I'd be interested to hear what people had to say, what a qualified person had to say about that. But I imagine it's innate, because even if you look at animals, well, I have some rabbits, and if they hear any kind of noise at the correct time, they get incredibly excited because they think you're about to feed them. So even across species, you can kind of see memory. They remember information, they respond to information. And I think with animals like humans who have adapted to speak a sort of verbal language and a written language and everything, it's probably an extension from something which is innate.
So you have rabbits as pets?
That's correct, yep. Very nice animals. I think what's interesting about rabbits, more so than dogs or cats, which I also like, a dog's always really excited anyway, regardless. Dogs aren't intimidated by people whatsoever, and in fact, people are intimidated by dogs sometimes, rightly so. But with rabbits, you have to learn to trust a little bit. You can't just approach a rabbit and think it's going to want to, think it's going to be pleased about it. Because the prey animals, I think everything's after them because they'd be mostly right. So I think what's interesting about a rabbit, trying to respond to a rabbit or trying to win a rabbit's trust, is that you have to adapt to their behavior, and you have to interact with them on their terms. Otherwise, they just run away.
Yeah, that reminds me when Bob Dylan visited Frank Zappa's house and Frank's dog, Doggus, barked at Bob. Frank said, "Don't worry, he only barks at Christians."
I love that story. It's brilliant. It'd have been interesting to have heard if Zappa what he'd have done with the album if he did actually produce it.
Oh, it would have been great.
Yeah.
And so, do thoughts create emotions?
No, I think thoughts are probably an extension of an emotion. Because a thought's kind of a post hoc rationalization. It's an abstraction or a way of trying to engage with a. It's a conceptualization and a way to engage with something that's just happened. Because if you think about it, more or less literally everything you experience is in the past. Because there's going to be there's a delay with this web link between us because we're all in different time zones, all using different systems. Likewise, there's a delay between assuming there's a material world. There's a delay between the phenomenal world passing into your awareness, and so everything's going to be in the past in that sense. So, so you're going to have to remind me of the question there because I got a little bit sidetracked.
You answered it well. It was, do thoughts create emotions?
So because that's all post hoc, basically, because there's a lag.
Post hoc. How do you spell that word hoc?
HOC, so Hotel Oscar Tango.
Oh, HOC, post hoc. I like that word. So, do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
It depends what you mean by meaning, but I think probably meaning. I mean, you can find a particular. So for me, I wouldn't pursue happiness because I don't think that's a very good idea because there's not really any lasting satisfaction. There's a sort of Epicurean view of happiness, which is, it sounds a little bit grim, but the idea of being happy or being content is actually, or pleasure more broadly, is that it's a negation of some form of discomfort or suffering of any degree. So I was reading The World as Will and Idea by Schopenhauer. That maybe makes me sound a little bit pretentious, but he outlines that he conceptualizes it as like a circuit of hot coals where there are gaps in the coal. So you might end up on a gap in the coal which you're having to constantly run around the circuit, and that's going to be a relief. But you are going to be back on the coals. So I think what's probably more important than pursuing some kind of lasting happiness, because whenever your satisfaction is fulfilled, a new need or want emerges anyway. I think it's more interesting or more practical to pursue in a hedonistic way, but not in a short-sighted hedonistic way, some kind of occupation in the moment, whether that's happiness or something else. So in that sense, you could say probably meaning rather than happiness, because happiness is kind of evasive as a permanent state anyway.
No, that was well done. Thank you. And does the brain more detect consciousness or create consciousness?
So I'd probably think that consciousness emerges from not just the brain, but again, I'm probably not qualified, but not just the brain, but probably the entire structure of the nervous system and everything. I was listening to, I'm not actually sure what his occupation is, but he does debates and he does discussions, and I think he's interested in philosophy. There's a man called Matt Dillahunty, and he came up with a metaphor I actually quite liked. He says consciousness is an emergent property of the physical being. So what he likened that to is the way that wetness as like one drop of water doesn't create wetness necessarily, but several drops or a lot of water creates wetness. So the wetness sort of emerges from the presence of water, and it's difficult to tell exactly at what point the property of wetness emerges, but it does. And I think that's a good way of putting it. I think Matt Dillahunt is right in articulating that he thinks that consciousness is an emergent property of the entire physical being.
I like that. And how do you spell Matt's last name?
D for Delta, I for India, then Lima Lima, LL, A for Alpha, H for Hotel, U for Umbrella or Uniform, N for November, and T for Tango.
Super. That was good. So what's faster, the speed of light or speed of thought?
Probably the speed of light, because as we were saying earlier, the light has to occur first, and there has to be a delay between the light and your interpretation. You have the light passing into your sort of consciousness.
And also, Sam, that was great. Thanks for being so dang articulate and concise. And a poet, Audre Lorde, said, "You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools." Yvonne Rainer countered, and she said, "You can if you expose the tools." What new tool do you suggest, relating to those quotes or not? Your choice.
So do you think you could clarify that a little bit more? Tool with in regards to?
It's basically, what new tools do you suggest in general? But it's sort of like, if you want to consider these to put it in a context, she says you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. And Yvonne says, no, you can if you expose the tool.
I suppose it depends on the individual and how they engage with the tool and what they were trying to do. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll put that into my own context. I want to put it into the context of music analysis, just because that's the first thing that comes to mind. And I'll put it in the context of analysis of Frank Zappa's music, because that's where we can probably relate quite well there. What I find quite interesting, I did an analysis of an interlude called Rollo Interior from St. Alfonso's Pancake Breakfast, and the way I analysed it was almost certainly not the way Zappa would have thought of it, because in the end I related it to the key of C major. Now, it's not in C major, but by using C major as a reference point, that allowed me to sort of articulate the global form of the piece, so the way the different sections related to each other harmonically. Now, it's not a piece of music which uses like a standard tonal harmonic system, like a functional harmony, but I found it useful to compare that to functional harmony in order to allow people who maybe weren't already familiar with Zappa's music or method of working to relate to understand it in the wider context beyond Zappa's music. And I think in that sense, there's some good literature about Zappa's methodology. Brett Clement has done some really good studies. And obviously Tyler Bartram's also done a very good job. He did the Alien Orifice video, and I think did a good job of analysing things on Zappa's terms more. So you can analyse it with the master's tools in that sense, and it's going to be fruitful. But I think you can approach it by putting it into a wider context. So, a house will reside in a town or a village, and music kind of exists in a canon or a lineage. By using outside tools as a point of reference, you can expose something about the work which maybe you wouldn't have exposed about it with the tools from which it was constructed.
Really well put. And it reminds me that through pattern recognition, you can have comprehensive awareness. And you, Brett, and Tyler have all helped people understand Frank's music better. And it's like when Ben Watson started reading his book to Frank, Frank goes, I don't know what you're talking about, but all the power to you, because my philosophy is art should do two things: fuck your shit up and go, I could do that. And basically, once you create your art, it's no longer yours. So someone can misinterpret it all they want or interpret it any other way. What you want to do is just prod people and needle the subnabulism.
Exactly.
Which is something that McEwen learned from Ezra Pound, the poet. He said that artists are the antenna of the race, and they're just broadcasting the hidden psychic effects of the things we invent. You know, we invented Winchell's donuts, and Frank sang about it, and all these people wonder, what's the heck is Winchell's donuts? And so what's the hidden psychic effect of why Frank's singing about a donut shop? So McEwen said we can look to the artist to uncover, expose by being the antenna of the race, broadcasting these hidden psychic effects, but we still ignore them. Why do humans still ignore the hidden psychic effects, even though we can turn to the artist to expose them?
I think in a lot of cases, maybe, first of all, I think maybe people aren't necessarily equipped to think about what they encounter beyond the surface level, which is fine. Some people just want to enjoy the sort of superficial aspect of a piece of art, or it's just a sort of temporary aesthetic experience. Some people get interested in the inner workings of it, but also even if you could turn to the artist to try and find out more about the underlying effects, intended effects at least, that's not always necessarily useful, because I think when a piece of art's been, I mean, as you touched upon a moment ago, as soon as a piece of art's been released into the world, there's not really nobody actually has any ownership over it. I mean, there's intellectual property rights and stuff, but that's all banal. In terms of what it means, again, I mean, you can assume that there is this outside material world and an objective reality, and there's a definite, undebatable underlying meaning to a piece of art or anything, but not necessarily, because each experience is based on a different set of a completely different set of experiences. So once it passes into somebody else's subjective experience, it can only mean something within the bounds of their experience. So it will only be useful to them in that context as well. And if the artist was to try and articulate to them what it means, or what the underlying intended effects or anything like that are, or are intended to be, then that'd be distorted and misinterpreted anyway, just in translation.
Yeah, very good. So in general, Sam, I know it's both and it depends. Are humans more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
Probably more feeling, because I think the thinking, the sort of abstract conceptualization comes after. I mean, for example, if I'm thirsty and I want to drink, what comes first is the feeling that I'm thirsty and I feel like I want to drink, and then I'll analyze the situation and think it would be a very good idea to go get a glass of water. So in that chain of events, the sort of, again, the post hoc rationalization of the analysis of the system, well, maybe not post hoc rationalization, but the analysis of the situation was after the fact, and then the action follows, but then the feelings, like the motive for it. So once you've got the feeling, that just acts as a motive for you to then behave in a particular way.
Sam, can you conjure up your earliest memory, or one of them, please?
The reason I have to have a think about it is because I can't remember if I can remember it, or I can't remember if I can remember seeing it in a photo album. It's a banal.
Yeah, that's why you conjure, so you can bring it up. However, that's a difficult thing for me to ask, because that's what usually people say. But that was good of you to say that. Thank you.
I think probably the first thing I can actually remember, in that I think I can remember the fear. It's incredibly banal, But I remember one Christmas, I got this little train, and you put a disc in the train, and it set a motor off, and the train started going around. Now, I didn't understand really that it wasn't, or that it wasn't like it didn't have any agency. So I didn't know what the train were doing. I do remember the fear. So I think that's probably my earliest memory, and that must have been around the age where I started developing memory, because I must have been about 3 or 4, probably 3.
Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
It depends what you're remembering. Probably more a blessing, because if we think about the fact that really the only experience, in my opinion, that particularly matters is the present experience, because if you're having a nice time now, once that's passed, it no longer matters. Or if you're having a bad time now, it matters then. But once it's passed, you only remember it, and then it sort of degrades over time. But you're stuck with the present, whether you like it or not. So memory is useful. Memory is a blessing in that sense, because it can engineer. Remembering how something happened or remembering how something felt engineers your behavior. It tells you how to act in the present to hopefully ensure the maximum or the optimum level of satisfaction in that particular moment. And I think if you didn't have memory, you'd never learn.
Sam, can you tell me one of your earliest role models, or someone who had an impact on you within your immediate family, and just briefly, and what was that impact? And then it's outside your immediate family. So someone who had, like, impact, role model within your immediate family, and what'd you get from them?
Probably within my immediate family, probably my mother, just because she got me interested in reading and was always ready to sort of indulge in my interests and hobbies. And what I got from that in particular was not just the sort of sense of freedom that gave me especially, but by reflecting on how I felt being given that kind of freedom and encouragement, it tells you something about, or I thought it tells you something about how your conduct should be towards other people as well, rather than necessarily trying to constrain them or impose anything upon them. It's from that I did learn it's more useful to develop cooperative and reciprocal relationships that are mutually beneficial. I mean, that goes for other family members as well, but I mean, I originated from my mother, so she's the first one that comes to mind.
No, that was well put. And then outside your immediate family, anyone who had an impact or role model for you, and what'd you get from them?
Outside my immediate family, in terms of people that I actually interacted with early on, I had a teacher called Mr. Baker. I can't remember his name, but he was always what I found helpful about him was if he needed any help doing something like setting up a printer in the classroom, or setting up some equipment, or anything where he needed a little bit of assistance, he never picked somebody that was already really good at it. He always picked someone whose skill had to develop. So I remember sometimes he'd pick me or someone else if he knew that we had the facility to, set up the printer or whatever else needed doing, but that we'd get something from that practical experience and from doing it, and you acquire ability that way, rather than just letting the kids that knew everything, that knew how to do it already. They didn't get anything from it. So it did used to pick people who'd learn something from it, and I'd say that's applied to my conduct in ways where I like to write music, and I like to record a lot of music, and so often I can record a lot of it at home, but I do like to get other people recording it, even parts that I could play sometimes, because I think music's a social exercise as well. I think it's interesting to involve other people and to network as well. So sometimes in sort of trying to find people, and because of the networking aspect, it's useful to take advantage of the internet to find people who you wouldn't be able to work with locally. But then there's a lot of people, and there's a selection process when you're doing that to try and figure out who'd be helpful. And I think in doing that, what's useful is finding someone that, or what's interesting, is finding someone that can play, but has the technical facility to be able to play it in a particular way or play a particular piece of music, but where you can't see much evidence of that happening before. So the last piece I recorded, there was this synthesizer line, really twisty-turny, sort of odd-metered, kind of like a Bulgarian folk dance feel. It was different to a Bulgarian folk dance, but the synth player I got on that usually just plays jazz fusion and funk, and she's a really good player. But giving her that exercise, giving her this piece, took her out of her comfort zone a little bit and forced her to apply sensibilities and a sense of articulation and everything in a context which was a little bit more unfamiliar. And I think that was more rewarding and more interesting than if you got somebody who was really familiar with the style. I think it has a practical effect, because an exciting thing about seeing people engage with music is if there's a little bit of a struggle between the performer and the material, if they have to get to grips with it, it creates a tension that's a lot more exciting, than if you program a piece in a computer. You can write music as complex as you want, and maybe decades ago that'd have been an exciting prospect, but anybody can do it now. You can type in anything as complex as you want and you'll hear it perfectly. So I think the tension that comes from a live performer struggling slightly with certain aspects of a piece is very interesting.
Really good, Stan. You evoked two things. Miles told one of his guitarists once, play like you don't know how to play the guitar. and then George Duke was told by Frank, play ice cream changes. He goes, dude, I'm a jazz player. I don't play that lowly crap. And we know it, when you hear George Duke play shortening bread in the middle of Rapunzel, that is like the Godhead moment to me in all of music. Okay, so did your parents raise you a particular religion?
No. So the school I went to was a Christian school. I think it was Church of England, but neither of them are particularly religious. I think my mother probably she's not showing any interest in religion, and I know my dad is definitely an atheist. I think that's the interesting thing in England. I think we're probably technically a Christian nation, but no one really seems to believe in. Not many people seem to believe in God in England, which I think is interesting to contrast with other countries like America, where it seems like anyway in America it can be kind of assumed that if somebody's not necessarily Christian, there are an underlying set of sort of inherited Christian values. And I mean, it's the same if you go somewhere like Ireland or I suppose Poland, kind of Catholic countries. But what I find interesting about England is that you just kind of assume whoever you're talking to is probably an atheist unless they tell you otherwise or unless you learn otherwise.
And so if God exists, what do you want God to tell you after you die?
Tell me that I've got a king-size bed and a television in my bedroom in heaven.
In your bedroom in heaven, yeah. Okay. Do you pray, Sam?
Only to myself.
Oh, that is a great answer. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
So I think evil implies some kind of moral judgment from the subject that perceives evil. I think it's probably more accurate to say that what you'd view as evil emerges from a set of circumstances. So not a lot of people, well, I mean, plenty of people who are aware of the concept, but not a lot of people that you talk to in what I've talked to in the flesh they don't necessarily find this particularly comfortable. But I think you can question whether a person has any actual sort of agency or libertarian free will whatsoever. Like, you didn't choose your hair color, you didn't choose your eye color, you didn't choose your height or the date of birth. So it seems strange and arbitrary that you'd suddenly be able to make personal choices once you've come into a being where you feel conscious. So it's maybe a reductionist way of looking at it in some ways, but I think it makes sense to look at people as being part of a much more complex chain where all these other facets of the chain act upon them and produce a certain result. So I don't think there's necessarily evil people. I wouldn't say there's not necessarily evil. You could, if evil's something that happens to you which is incredibly disadvantageous, it could be an abstract evil like poverty. We could call poverty an evil, or it could be getting punched in the face. You could, an act of malice, that could be evil. But in terms of that act being carried out by a person, I'd question whether that person would have actual agency in order for that to qualify as evil in a traditional sense, as in a wrongdoing. Rather, you could look at it as an incredibly unfortunate happenstance.
Yeah, really well put. And so, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? I'm going to set this one up with a few modern thinkers' thoughts. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurais, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. Fellini says, I need an enemy. Chinese proverb goes, he who cannot agree with their enemy is controlled by them. So the basic question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to the Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
I think it depends. So in terms of the Alan Watts quote, if it's an enemy in the sense of another person who has a conflict of interest or a conflict of will with you, then probably in some situations, if you acknowledge them, you empower them. If let's say. Let's say I'm hungry and I know somebody else that's hungry and we're in a similar vicinity and there was one packet of cornflakes left. If I was to sort of interact with them and this is maybe not a very good example, but if I were to interact with them, then that raises the chance that they'll learn about the packet of cornflakes too, and then it just sort of emphasizes the conflict of interest. I think in some situations, if you acknowledge people and maybe unnecessarily give, if you were to unnecessarily legitimize them by giving them the time of day and airing the views or behavior, and you disagreed with it, you didn't find it useful, then probably acknowledgement's not very useful at all. If it's more abstract though, if I'm hungry and let's say hunger if whatever is my enemy, then probably I'll acknowledge it and that'll be useful because I'll be able to resolve it in doing so.
Right. And so is that your how would you just briefly tell someone how to deal with an enemy? By that philosophy just then, or is that
so? I suppose it depends on the enemy then. So, and it depends on what the enemy is doing. I mean, if you're in the street and someone punches you and they're an enemy in a kind of banal sense like that, then you have to make an assessment. Maybe if you have the physical ability to retaliate and subdue them, maybe pursue that. Maybe if you don't, but you do have a facility to escape, then run away. If it's an enemy like if it's like a circumstantial, more abstract enemy like poverty or something like that, then there are mechanisms at play that are causing that situation. In which case, acknowledgement's definitely key. So, for example, in England, if we were to suffer from, if someone was to suffer from poverty or some kind of systematic problem, then in that kind of situation, you'd have to acknowledge it either by, you might want to talk to a representative in Parliament to try and get the issue brought forward to administrators who could deal with it, or you might want to find out if there are any institutions or charities available that can help you with the problem. So I'd say that probably to condense it, the key is probably knowing when to engage with an enemy and when not to engage with an enemy, depending on the context.
Yeah, that's good. Condensed. So James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin about 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, "This is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree?" Years later, Faulkner said, "Sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism." Sam, why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
So I think it's about aesthetic experience and trying to engineer a specific aesthetic experience. So I'm from Wakefield in West Yorkshire. I recommend that you never go to Wakefield. I live in Manchester, but I'm from Wakefield, and don't go to Wakefield. It's not very good. But there's a couple of parks, there are a couple of trees, but mostly it's quite industrial. So, for example, if I lived in Wakefield and I wanted an aesthetic experience which wasn't available in Wakefield, then I might go and see a film about anything. For example, the Grand Canyon, or if I was interested in particular ideas, then I might want to go watch a film, or I might want to listen to a particular piece of music. I'll go to a gallery to engage. To engage with, on an aesthetic level, with the world and other people's sort of presentation of the world. I think the thing is, when you're actually experiencing something in the flesh, most of the time you don't have pause to engage with it in a purely aesthetic way, because you're contending with 1,000 different things at once, 1,000 different necessities, sort of banal, mundane necessities, like how hungry are you, how tired are you, all these kinds of factors that can be distracting from the aesthetic experience. So I think what's interesting about art, film or any type of art, is that you can elect when to engage with it, and then that gives you the opportunity to completely focus on the aesthetic experience and to contemplate it without the distraction, or without as much risk of the distraction of all of the things in your environment in that moment that would compel you to act otherwise, act in accordance with your needs, as opposed to being able to actually contemplate.
Yeah, that was well done. And so, Sam, what first attracted you to pursue music? Tell us sort of briefly the history. Your parents were playing recorded music around the house live. When did you go, oh, I can do that?
Well, I didn't like music for quite a long time. I mean, my dad played guitar and my uncles played guitar, and I quite enjoyed what they did. But I didn't necessarily think, oh, that's something I'd like to do, until probably about 10, because my dad played guitar, and he'd show me a couple of things on the guitar, how to play the instrument, just the basic mechanics of it and everything. And that was nice as an exercise, but it didn't particularly pique my interest in music, because I didn't hear much music that I thought was very interesting, because a lot of the music you're exposed to day, it's sing-songs, it's people singing about things, which was perfectly fine. But I do have one distinct memory. We had this really cheesy school karaoke very often around Christmas and those type of events, and they always used to hang up this screen with all the lyrics on. And I did note at the time that my favorite parts of the song were where it said instrumental, because you didn't have to listen to anybody. You just got to focus on what the music was doing. You have to talk to people every day, so you get sick of hearing the human voice sometimes. So the instrumental was nice. And so later on, when I actually got interested in doing it myself, that's around the time I began to discover more music which did focus on instrumental music, like jazz and jazz fusion, and certain forms of Western classical music. And probably the two most important formative ones, which I thought, which compelled me to act, were probably a band called Mr. Bungle, because they weren't strictly instrumental, but the way the voice was used was as a sort of textural. It was instrumental music with human voice, but it wasn't like a sing-song. And then the second, so that compelled me to write, especially the bassist Trevor Dunn, because he wrote all this like chamber music, and he had a website where he talked about the different bass lines he played and all the different basses and equipment he used. But one of the things, he had a handwritten score of one of the lines everyone always wanted to learn when he taught lessons. So that compelled me to pick up a pen and paper and learn to read and write and do music like that. And the second one that sort of really crystallized that was definitely Zappa, because I liked all the jazz fusion and the jazz and the classical music. And when I listened to the Zappa material, I just thought that's brilliant, because it's all of the best parts of jazz fusion and classical rolled into one. And I still think that's the most appealing aspect of Zappa's music. I mean, the stuff from the mid-60s up until like the mid-70s especially really sort of hit the mark of what I wanted to hear, but had hitherto not been available. Well, it had been available for many decades, but to me it had not been available. Yeah.
Really well put. I love Frank's line. What do you think of jazz rock fusion? He says, the only fusion I see is between the cash box and the musician. And then Mr. Bungle, when he came, like, you know, I have this question for our Zappa Zooms. I don't know if I asked it with you yet, but it's like, who's your favorite Zappa wannabe? And it's like, Gail Zappa once told me when she heard Mr. Bungle, she goes, we should sue these people. They're ripping Frank off. Or, you know, not sue, but you know what I'm saying. She was just like, he said, this is a direct rep. Which is, you know, Mike Patton and Mr. Bungle, all the power to him. So a screenwriting teacher told me, Sam, that great art, great film, great music is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Stanley Kubrick says the opposite. Great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process?
In terms of me actually devising pieces, it depends on the type of piece. So I've got, I've probably got the sketches around here actually, but I wrote a piece for piano, which, yeah, I can't find the sketches, but I wrote a piece for piano which was really focused on structure. Basically, I had to write tablature for the 10 different fingers because each finger was assigned an individual rhythm, and the piece was a process piece about the way it began with a homogeneous rhythm, all just clusters, and each finger was eventually assigned a different rhythm. So you had like this 10-part polyrhythm, and the lines gradually expanded, which meant it'd start to poke holes in the rhythms, and new rhythms had emerged from that process. So in that sense, in a piece like that, my intention kickstarts the process, and then the detail emerges. So excuse me. And then detail emerges from the process, which I might not have otherwise imagined. Then there's other pieces where you might just write it stream of consciousness, or you might give it more. I might give it more consideration than that. But where it's more about in terms of what I will to hear from one moment to the next. That tends to be how I'll try to write pieces that are maybe more jazz oriented, or pieces which have some kind of more clearly melodic aspect to them, because I mean I've lived in England for my entire life, so I've absorbed diatonic music and developed an intuition for it. So intention in that respect is sort of at the forefront, because that's the kind of situation where I write a score, hand it to a performer, and will them to play what I previously devised. So I think there's different degrees of intention which all have different aesthetic effects, which are all equally as viable depending on the situation. And I think intention's probably the most interesting thing to engage with, because if in two respects. So it's interesting to see the end result and compare the intention to what I did. And I think that applies to everybody in a way. I mean, for example, one thing I find interesting about Zappa is how finicky and how detail-oriented he was. And I think it's interesting that I can't think of an exact quote, but I have seen the sentiment that he felt that nothing really that he produced quite matched his intention, but very closely approximated it, maybe in some cases less closely than others. But I think what's interesting in that is intention is quite nebulous, because an intention can change anyway. It reminds me of I'll try not to go on too much of a tangent, but it reminds me of the sort of idea that you have like Platonic ideas and phenomenal items. In the Platonic idea exists in the abstract, and every manifestation of it is merely an imperfect approximation of it. So in my opinion, someone like Zappa could never be satisfied with the final product, because the very intention itself is kind of nebulous and not concrete until it's passed into phenomenal existence. And that's what I find interesting to engage with when I write, is that on different levels. If I write a process piece, I know the process, but I enjoy the surprise of the things that I didn't consciously intend to happen, the individual occurrences. And when I write a piece where I do have a sense that it's a linear piece where I've decided what note should come after the next and what should occur at the same time as another note or whatever, another part. And what's then interesting to me is how that intention's communicated to another musician and how that's distorted once they interpret it. And then also there's another degree. When they play it, they intend to play it a certain way, but how they play it can only be an approximation of how they intend to play it. So it's filtered through these various degrees until you've got this kind of hazy object that just never had a chance of matching the original intention. And I think that's the most interesting thing, and it's inevitably the key thing that's always engaged with in any type of medium, any type of art.
Yeah, really well put. And then evoked a lot. Shelly Manne, the great jazz drummer, actually told me once, I says, what was it like playing with Frank? He said, that guy knew what he wanted and got what he wanted. So all this stuff, you know, people in the movie and all this stuff saying Frank's, he was a slave to his inner ear and blah, blah, blah. He never got what he wanted or only approximate. Like, this is a great jazz drummer saying, he knew what he wanted and he got what he wanted. So it's all degrees of perception indeed. And do you make your living being in the music business, being a musician?
So I used to solely teach music. I was a private instrumental tutor, and that's mainly how I did it. And now, not anymore. I still teach occasionally, and I still because I used to do a few things. I used to teach, and I used to do orchestrations for people overseas and stuff like that. And from that you kind of piece together each payment, and that's your living. More recently, since moving, around the time of COVID, unfortunately, all kicked off, I actually decided to get a part-time job in a non-musical domain for two reasons. The first reason is COVID. Like music's been hit dreadfully during this period, and the second reason is all the time I spent as an instrumental tutor. I enjoy working with other people and I enjoy teaching, but that's a lot of time preparing materials that aren't necessarily very interesting. You know, you've got to prepare different materials and different lessons for, because I mainly taught beginners as well, so I'd prepare different materials and everything, and I'd spend hours doing this. And then I just thought, well, you spend all day looking at a piece of manuscript paper and producing this kind of stuff, and you think, in a way, it frees you up a little bit more to be able to disengage with that aspect of it and only write your own music, and focus all your sort of attention and energy on that aspect of it. I'm not sure if I'll decide to return to just doing music. I might. It depends on circumstance, even COVID notwithstanding. Because either way, look, teaching's also kind of a day job in and of itself. And then I think that comes back to the idea that you're an individual in a chain of events. Like in some situations, music's going to be really fruitful and really helpful and fulfilling. In other situations, it's going to create a precarious situation, and then that's going to compromise your ability to do music at all if you're spending all your time trying to, especially in this type of environment, trying to chase gigs and stuff. So
yeah, no, that was good. You summarized it well, and it reminded me again to go back to Frank. Frank said, you know, when he started delving into the synclavier music, oh, I would have never gone on the road if I had this years ago. And it's like, thank God, because the beauty of Frank's music was that he did have to stand in line at a burrito store on Melrose Avenue in LA. And he did have to do normal things in hotels, you know, traveling as a band with live musicians. So if clothing is an extension of our skin, knife and fork extends our teeth, you know, everything humans invent, philosophy extends our soul, whatever you want to say. If everything humans invent extends some humanness, what does the guitar extend for you? What humanness?
Probably it's probably a cathartic physical outlet. It's because it's not. I'm not very interested in sport or any such thing. So as far as I'm concerned, something like the guitar or the bass or any instrument or any type of musical practice, as it is in a way, it's because it's cathartic. You can view it as kind of being an extension or a manifestation of the will, of an abstract willing, and in that sense, a lot of things can be encoded within that. So the guitar specifically, I suppose, is a manifestation of physical will, because there's a direct physical action that has to take place in order for the guitar to have any meaning. You know, right now it's just an image. If you were to pick it up and engage with it, then the result of that is it's physical, and then that encodes a particular type of meaning in it. So it's cathartic. It's cathartic in a particular way. There's a tactile sensation, and then there's feedback between what you do and how you feel with the instrument that maybe influences you in ways where if you were to pick up a pencil and start writing music, there's less of a tactile or less of a stimulating sort of tactile feedback there. So in that kind of more sedentary activity. So the guitar in particular, I'd see any musical activity as an extension of some sort of will. And the guitar in particular is specifically a physical will.
What's another word for will? Just simple.
So you could look at will as maybe being intention, or feeling, or a directed feeling.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so what's more important, Sam, conviction or compromise? I know it depends. You already know it depends.
I mean, probably conviction, because you're going to be forced to compromise anyway. So, so conviction to realize a particular intention, that's going to, as soon as that enters into its environment, there's going to be all kind of factors acting upon it that compromise it anyway. So, conviction, because if you sit and you think about how you're going to have to compromise in advance, you've already seeded on many points before you've even tried to carry out an action. And so what you get then is a much more pale approximation of maybe what you originally wanted. Whereas if conducting yourself with conviction and sticking to the original intention as much as whatever you think the original intention is, it'll yield nothing can ever be a perfect replication of the intention anyway. So if you conduct yourself with conviction, then it approximates it much more closely than if you already make a bunch of concessions before you even act.
T.S. Eliot said poetry's outing your inner dialogue. Sam, what language is your inner dialogue in?
English. No.
What form is your inner consciousness in?
So I think it's a formless, nebulous, abstract sense of willing and intention that's then analysed, and then it's difficult to explain, because it's kind of a thing that exists unto itself, and any way you can try and articulate it becomes a distortion of whatever it is. I mean, to be honest, I think that's the boundary of knowledge. It's like like asking what's the essence of everything. Well, God knows.
That's a good new question I should ask. What is the essence of everything? But one of my favorite answers was sort of what you just said. I asked this great experimental filmmaker in New York City, Abigail Child. I says, what language is your inner dialogue in? She goes, I wish I knew. Okay, so there's a mantra that goes, ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas, experimental filmmaker, says, there's no self-expression. Cecil Taylor says that I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. So is art making, music making more a vehicle of whatever culture and technology is dominant, or more self-expression? I know it's both and it depends, but what do you lean a little more towards art making is?
So, I mean, in terms of the individual's role, it's probably more that they are kind of a vehicle for it, because any sense of intention's kind of illusory. You were compelled, your intentions formed by your environment. You're compelled by your environment to act in a certain way, and it makes you feel a certain intention. So in that chain, you, as somebody who's producing something, is a vehicle. So the existing technologies, existing idioms, you're already engaging with them, whether you like it or not, and that is because of what you're producing. And so in that sense, definitely a vehicle rather than necessarily being an individual expression, because any individual expression you make is compelled by outside factors anyway, and it's just part of a bigger chain. So really, if you actually zoom out and look at everything in the abstract, really you could say that everything's kind of a gradation of one thing. So probably, I'll tell you what it reminds me of. It reminds me of two things. It reminds me of what Schopenhauer calls the will, like this sort of nebulous will, the essence of everything. And it also reminds me, which also in turn reminds me of Zappa's idea of the big note as well. So I'd say you're a vehicle for the expression, not of what your intention, but of your environment.
Yeah, that was really good. And can art making be egoless? Music making, art making?
Um, John Cage made a lot of efforts to sort of disengage the ego in producing music or in producing art. But probably not. And the reason I don't think so is because, and I'll try not to be too grim, there was a Norwegian philosopher called Peter Wessel Zapffe. And he wrote, he wrote an essay called "The Last Messiah," and he talks about 4 different types of. But basically, the entire thing is about recognizing that everything's just fundamentally. He calls it the terror of the situation. Everything's just fundamentally sort of hostile, and the absurdity of being a conscious being is just a terrible burden in and of itself. And so we produce 4, what he outlines as 4 different methods of coping with it. One of them is sublimation, which is taking that sort of what he calls the terror of the situation, taking that and turning it into a piece of art. So whether that's music or anything. And in that sense, but one thing he does say is that if the burden of existence, it sounds so grim, but if the burden of existence was to weigh upon somebody so heavily, they wouldn't produce anything at all because they'd be too depressed to do so. So I think that you can't really produce art without there being some semblance of ego. If ego's recognition of the individual self and seeing it as separate from the rest of its environment. Otherwise, I don't see how there'd be an impetus to produce, because you'd think that everything was already expressed anyway.
Yeah, no, you anticipated a question coming up, but before I ask that one, Duchamp says there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your audience when you're making your art? When you're writing your music down, how much are you thinking of your audience?
Very little, to be honest, because what I like about the present era is that out of view of a camera, I have a tiny little interface that sits on my desk that I can just really easily plug into and record at any time. So, and because I said earlier on as well, I think it's useful to look at music as kind of a social activity and something which you do, whether somebody is able or chooses to pursue that as a career unto itself, or whether they choose to do it less, whether they choose to pursue it less fervently. It's still a behavior that can really easily be manifested now that we've got the technology. You know, you don't have to hire a studio or anything really anymore to realize it. You can just buy some equipment, plug in, record it. If you can't do that, you can write it, type it in and record it. And so I think for me, it's important to consider what I want to hear, because for me, the reason to write music is to write music that I haven't heard yet, because nobody else is doing it. And this lets me segue into the second point in that, which is that in order to write music that I want to hear that I can't hear because I haven't heard anyone do it yet, I have to draw upon stuff I already like. So, for example, I might listen to a Zappa piece and think, yeah, you know, I really liked the sort of voice leading in the keys part in this particular section of Redunzel. But then I might listen to a Bulgarian folk song by Stoyan Yankulov or someone and think, you know, I want to take the rhythm of that and produce something which is somewhere between the two. You know, because listening to Zappa wouldn't scratch that same itch, neither would listening to Stoyan Velichkov. And so what that means is there's already somebody that feels like me that wants to hear that. There's already somebody that at least likes Zappa, or at least likes Charles Mingus, or at least likes Stoyan Velichkov. And just by virtue of the fact that I do, and I'm doing it. So there must be an audience, even if there's 2 or 3 people. or more. You know.
It's like I tell Tyler to listen to, Bernard Herrmann. I want him to be, composer and listen to Hermeto Pascal and Astor Piazzolla. And have you ever heard Carla Bley? And he goes, "Oh, I have heard Carla Bley." And, you guys are really impressing me. I'm sure you even know who the Shags are.
Oh, yeah.
Now that's where you should be making music. Okay, so there's a saying that goes, "You create what you resist." Or Bob Goldthwait morphed it into, "You are what you hate." James Joyce said, "It's a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you disbelieve." Louis Buñuel nailed it. He said, "Thank God I'm an atheist." So just take that. I'm not saying I agree or disagree. What you resist persists. Take this idea and just let me hear your ideas on it. You create what you resist. Not meaning Sam, but this idea that one creates what one resists.
So I can see some logic to it. So if the act of creating is something which is compelled by different factors in the environment, then I suppose you could look at the act of creation as being an attempt to reconcile conflicting conflicting things in your environment which are compelling you to act. And I think that's why it's interesting. That's why I think the concept of originality is quite interesting, in that it's literally impossible if you look at everything as an organized, as a sort of linear chain of events, which is how you'd subjectively perceive it, even if that's not how it is. So in terms of, I think you could conceptualize that as a form of resistance, in that there's a conflict which then you attempt to reconcile, and then the product is this output.
Is perception reality?
No. But I mean, it's debatable as to, well, I don't think so. It's debatable as to what reality is anyway. I mean, yes, I suppose, because again, you can't actually determine whether there's a material world. You're limited to your perceptive apparatus, and that's it. So, as far as you subjectively perceive it, yes, it is reality. I mean, I don't want to go on about it too much because I'm not an expert, because I've read like one book, but I find it interesting the way Schopenhauer's conceptualized it, in that the subject, so the knowing subject, needs the object, because in order to be a knowing subject, it needs something to know, and the object needs the subject because it can't be known if there's no knowing subject. So there's this kind of reciprocal relationship. Yeah. So perception could be reality, because, I mean, if I die, I don't know that the world will continue to exist. Like, if I won't know that there's this material objective world that will exist after me anyway, it could just be my idea. Otherwise,
yeah. Sam,
so yes and no.
Yeah, no, you answered it well. I loved it. Can you forget to die?
In a way. And I think when I've thought about that question before, and I gave the complete opposite answer to what I'll give now, which is yes, I think you can. I mean, obviously you're going to pass out of phenomenal existence whether you like it or not. But what I find quite interesting is, if you think about how you perceive other people, your knowledge of what or who they are is completely limited to your experience of them as an object. So, I'm talking to you. You might be a subject that's like me. You might have a subjective experience that's similar to mine. I can't confirm that, though. You might just be, I might have made you up, but I'm experiencing you as though you're real. So in that sense, even if a person passes out of phenomenal existence, it depends what you define as being that person, whether it's them as a material object, Is it the body? Probably not. Is it the personality that actively engages with its environment? I mean, maybe, but not necessarily. Is it the impression that it leaves on me, the subject? Probably, in terms of my own experience, yes. So it maybe sounds a little bit romantic and cliche, but even in terms of in terms of your impression of people, and even if that's in the form as like a lasting impression, like a memory, then you could conceptualize that as continuing to sort of live. So let's take a grim scenario where I decide, don't worry, I'm not going to, but let's say I decide I want to die and I decide to remove myself from existence and I kill myself. That sounds really grim. I'm not going to do it. But let's say I do that. Unfortunately, for me, if I want all trace of my existence to be completely eradicated, I have no control over that. People are still left with those impressions who had them anyway. And in that sense, you've left that's all left behind, and that's still passed through experience. I mean, the impetus for us talking is that we all had a mutual interest in Zappa's music, which has lasted for decades. And in that sense, that is an aspect of a person's action. It's still got that half-life. It still outlives the phenomenal existence.
Yeah, that's great. McEwen said a half a truth is still a lot of a truth. A half a life is still a lot of a life. Frank forgot to die. Okay. Lewis Carroll said, I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Have you believed in any impossible things lately?
That one stumped me, actually, because it makes me wonder what's impossible. I mean, I believe that England could be a nice place a couple of years ago.
No, I was going to say, Sam, Mr. Smarty Pants, I could see some logic to it himself. Couldn't got stumped. Thank God I stumped him. No, this is really fun. So, Sam, Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says that it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength rather than we're taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness that you've morphed into a strength, that you've turned this breakdown into a breakthrough.
So I suppose you could apply it to something like music, and I suppose in music there are lots of different traditions, lots of different practices, and some people can be good at a lot of them. Not everyone can be good at them all. Nobody can be good at them all because there's such a plurality of them. It's just impossible. And so. I'm a fairly competent bassist and everything, and I can play a lot of different types of music. One thing which I find quite useful, though, is to not actually try to be able to play everything, because it can be distracting from your key set of interests. So in that sense, I think rather than viewing it as a weakness that I'm not going to be able to play Bulgarian folk music on the bass as well as somebody that's been immersed in that culture for a long time. I could choose to try and train myself in it and get a bit better at it and everything, but I think it's more useful to sort of, if as long as you're able to function in other contexts and you're able to pursue those contexts in which you can function, it's more useful to address that inadequacy, accept it, and then integrate aspects of it into your existing set of competencies. One way in which that's actually happened, just so it's not so abstract, is I wrote a piece a while back which I finished recording a few months ago called Bell Horror, and it's based on it's based on a Bulgarian dance. I've actually forgot the name of it, but it's this 22/16 dance. Sounds really natural. What I like about the Bulgarian rhythms is that it's not like Western progressive rock music or jazz fusion, where there's this kind of really like clockwork grid. The beat itself is flexible. Some beats are long and some beats are short, and you can snap it to like to a grid, but it's not necessarily meant to be played that way. And I know that I can't play that kind of music with the same feel as somebody that grew up in a particular place and absorbed that music, because there's regional differences even within that. Someone in one village might play a pie disco different to someone from another, or from one town or one region. So what was useful in that piece was, rather than worrying about trying to represent that music as Bulgarian music, because I can't, I don't have that skill, it was to take some of the key ideas, some of the key rhythmic ideas, push them into like a sort of like a jazz or sort of classical European context, I suppose, Western European context, and then accept the result as something which is unique unto itself, rather than just being an inadequate approximation of music that I couldn't actually play and represent.
Wow, you answered that well, Sam. Thank you. And so I think we all, with Frank, me and you, we all share a love of the Bulgarian Women's Choir, who charted on the pop charts in England once. Thank God for inventing a new genre. So what is the most significant difference between women and men, physical aside?
I think it's quite difficult to answer, because I think it varies from individual to individual, and I also think it's difficult to make a generalization, because the physical is so closely bound to behavior as well. I mean, if we look at this idea of consciousness being sort of precipitating from lots of smaller factors, if we think of consciousness as like an emergent property, then the physical differences are also really important, but also the physical differences are also kind of nebulous as well. So, for example, I mean, one key difference that people often pick up is that, which is actually a bit too reductive, is that men have a Y chromosome, an XY, and women have an XX chromosome, and the idea is that the Y chromosome activates this thing called the Wolffian system, which causes the production of testosterone, and then it produces what we'd look at as being male genitalia, and then they grow hair and everything. But then you get some people that maybe had a Y chromosome, but then the Wolffian system didn't necessarily activate and do all this stuff, and they have a testosterone deficiency, meaning they have the sort of physical attributes of a woman. Well, not of the physical attributes of a woman, but they might not produce as much hair, and they might have traits more closely associated with women. So because even the physical boundaries are so nebulous and not quite as intuitive as what it seems to begin with. I mean, some people have both male and female genitalia. Yeah, I think there's probably not much of a difference at all in terms of behavior or temperament, in that they're still products of their environment.
Really well put. Thank you. Sam, how do you find peace of mind?
Lots and lots of beer.
That is a great answer. I was in England once. These people, like, I'm not a beer drinker, and they just forced me till like 2 a.m. You've got to drink another one. You got.
I actually think it's also a good route to liver disease, so it's maybe not one I recommend. But yeah, I mean, to maybe answer slightly more seriously, and I'll keep it brief, is that peace of mind's basically unattainable because then you'd have no impetus to act. So I suppose in being a depressant, it's kind of a serious answer because it eventually you black out. So you're not doing anything then.
Sam, if you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
Fuck off.
What happened to the intellectual Sam, man?
Okay. I don't think there's much I'd be able to say to myself other than just
that's all right.
Get on with it. You know,
we can be fine. You answered it well.
Because I probably wouldn't have listened to myself anyway. I'd have just done what I wanted.
Right. So, which way should toilet paper come off the roll? Over or under?
Under. Over. It just makes a lot more sense. If it's under, you have to pull it more. If it's over, it sometimes if you pull it, if it's over, it just snaps off. It never seems to snap off if it's under.
If a publisher was to release your autobiography off the top of your head, what would the title be?
Despair.
And they want to scent the glue in the binding. What smell would it be?
Now, this is going to make me sound like a junkie. I'm not. And I don't lurk around petrol stations. But I really, really like the smell of petrol. So it'd definitely be petrol scented.
That is good. Very good.
But it wouldn't have the fumes.
Yeah, no fumes. Petrol smell, no fumes. Good. Like that. If a statue was built in your honor, where would you want it displayed and what would it be made of?
The Bermuda Triangle, and it'd be made of salt.
Oh, nice. Tell me something good you never had and you never want.
I want everything that's good. The demo tapes that Mr. Bungle recorded for the first album.
Nice.
I've got the album. And it sounds fantastic.
Good. You know they're good. You never have it. You never had it, and you never want it. That is a good answer. If you were in a vat of vomit up to your neck and someone threw a bag of shit at your face, what would you do?
Throw up.
We're going to do these 5 Alan Watts questions, just really quick, just right off the top of your head. If I can find them, oh my God. Let's see. Here we go. Oh, here we go. Who started it all?
When did it start? I'll answer it with a question.
No, answering a question with a question is a really winner move in this series. Are we going to make it?
Where?
Where do we put it?
Over there.
Who's cleaning it up?
Somebody who I hope's being paid very well to do so.
Nice. Is it serious?
Constantly, but no, not really. The seriousness negates itself. If everything's serious, nothing is.
Yeah, like Frank says, he was very serious about being not serious. That was fun. This is really fun, Sam. A few more. Aaron Copeland says the 4 elements or ingredients of music are melody, harmony, rhythm, and tone color. How do you describe what tone color is in layperson's terms?
So tone color, I think maybe in the way he's describing it, you could look at it as being timbre, and what timbre would be, it'd be the sort of raw sound of an instrument, or the way an instrument's played or articulated. One example would be if you play a violin, if you play it towards the bridge, so what they'd call sol ponticello, it's a much more abrasive sound. If you play towards the neck, so sul tasto, it's a much more a much less abrasive sound and a much not softer in terms of volume, but it's much less abrasive and much more lyrical. So tone color is the raw sound of either an instrument or the way a set of instruments are used in order to produce a general sense of there being a sound with varying levels of detail.
Very good. My friend says the three tenets T's of music are taste, technique, and theory, similar to Dave Liedman, the great saxophonist for Miles. He said hand, head, and heart. So we know you can learn technique and theory. Taste. How does one acquire taste in music? And you can't say listening. We already know that.
I actually don't think it is listening. I think it's just the environment you're in, and the way you react to the environment. So a lot of people might be in, I suppose this is anecdotal, so let's maybe not put too much stock in it, but a lot of people seem to really like sing songs and pop music where it centers an individual and they sing about their experience. And some people react really well to that and they like it. Other people, like me when I was little, don't really like that and prefer the bits where it's instrumental. But even in those, so that it's a reaction for or against. You either accept it or reject it. And so taste sort of develops from culture and from individual experience of culture, which I think is quite interesting because that can be processed a million times over. But it's the thing about originality not really existing, because it's kind of a really writing any new music or producing anything that's new or having any new experiences, kind of taking one thing that existed, comparing it to another, distorting it, and then doing that until it's unrecognizable.
Really well put. And Thelonious Monk says there's no wrong notes. Agree or disagree?
It depends if you're writing a harmony exercise for school. If I told Mr. Williams that, he would have just given me like 10 points on my counterpoint exercises.
Very good. And Joseph Boyes said, make the secrets productive. Lou Welsh, beat poet, ad man, said, guard the secrets, constantly reveal them. It's actually Thornton Wilder in 1928 nailed it. Art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time. Sam, you've been really honest and laid your cards on the table. You're so articulate. I learned a lot from you. I'm not insinuating you haven't said this, but what's it really all about for you?
That's also difficult to answer because I might misinterpret that. Again, for me to look at my behavior and for me to try and explain the motivations for the behaviors, a form of post hoc rationalization, I really wish I could remember the name of the researcher. It's on a good podcast called The Dissenter, which is done by a bloke called Ricardo Lopez. He interviews people from all different professions, but I remember one in particular where he had a guest on who in particular believed that or seemed to advocate that every sort of sequence of events as we see them it's actually in and of itself complete chaos, which is rationalized. Subjectively, it feels like for me doing music or producing anything like that is basically just a way of engineering a particular aesthetic experience that I want Now, why do I want that particular aesthetic experience? Well, probably for the same reasons that Peter Wessel-Zapfer or Schopenhauer might have articulated, which is that if you do take an Epicurean view of pleasure and see it as a negative thing, not as in a bad thing, but in terms of pleasure being a negation of a discomfort, then it's probably what Peter Wessel-Zapfer would describe as sublimation, turning a discomfort to I hesitate to say to my advantage, but I'll say to my advantage.
Yeah. No, we'll bring in Clifford now to ask you a couple of a question or two, and then I'll close it out. But really been amazing, because we also say what you said, discomfort into an advantage. We say you flip a breakdown into a breakthrough, or a rejection into a redirection. And I think in popular music, the best example is Iggy Pop said his band was so bad at imitating the Rolling Stones, they invented punk rock, which is a classic one. So, Sam, we're honored to have Clifford know Clinton to know which buttons to push and get this wonderful time on the online and tape for YouTube's consumption. Clinton, it's your question time. Thank you so much for all your help.
Yeah, no problem, Gerry. Hey, Sam.
Hello.
Great talk. It's rather serendipitous. My friend introduced me to Mr. Bungle 2 evenings ago, so it's just very fresh. Great to get some actual backstory here. It's hilarious. Just because it's interesting that you're into this, more esoteric jazz fusion styles, sort of like this is sort of, it seems like woke you up musically. I got me thinking about what I've been reading about English literary criticism lately. Mainly, in short, the English literary critic Q.D. Leavis in 1932 is talking about the state of the novel. I'm just wondering if there's like some comparison between novels and music here. But printed English began in like 1709, 1712 with the mass publication of these magazines like the Tatler and Spectator, which sort of homogenized English. Right, that's really when the language became one language, because these magazines were written in the common tongue, and then slowly from there books developed and things got fancier and fancier and poetic techniques grew, and then you had the crazy modernist novels in the early 1900s, right? And like James Joyce, Jerry's favorite go-to. It took a while to build up English into a language that was capable of building a language or making a book like that, right? So in 1932, Q.D. Leavis, she writes even if the modern set out to defy the stratification which has been demarcated and resolve to address the entire community, the consciousness that the community he was addressing consisted of different reading publics at varying levels would rob him of the complete confidence necessary to a work of art. So it kind of reminded me of your idea of compromising, sort of taking away some of the initial will or intention. So the fact that you listen to these, to me, very strange bands, for instance, how is music, what's the idea of how music has sort of stratified, or how audiences, how do you address a whole audience, or how do you find the few people who like what you're into?
So, I mean, it's interesting because I think music follows a similar trajectory to sort of literature as you described it. So, if I think about like pre-notation, pre-written music practices, and if we think about like Roman Gallican chants, I mean they did write that down actually. But if we think about music having a function in particular settings like the church a few centuries ago, then its function and purpose was based. It was because it was a religious practice. It was sort of a form of worship, and it was valuable to people who practiced that religion and existed in that culture. And whereas if we were to compare that to how music's consumed Now we've had notation, so at least in the Western classical canon, you can look at old scores and you can develop them, and then styles gradually, styles gradually develop that way. And then you've got recorded technology. And what's interesting is when you've got recorded technology in the early 20th century, is that that then means that music can kind of become an object that can be consumed apart from the social situation in which it originally emerged. And so it can take on a different meaning then, because if you went to Birdland to watch Charlie Parker or someone, you had something in common with everyone else at Birdland. Or if you was in the church singing a Roman Gallican chant, you had an immediate means of relating to everybody else doing the same thing by virtue of the fact that you was there with them. Once you've got recorded music, and once that's disseminated by what's also interesting are the sort of forces that help to disseminate that. So somebody has to choose what music gets recorded, who records it, who distributes it, where it's distributed, and then it shapes culture in that way. And in a way, it gives people a wider reach. It gives the people with the resources to produce and disseminate music a wider reach to influence culture at large. And I think it's interesting to see the way, not just the meaning of music to the individual, so how a person responds culturally to what a piece of music sounds like. You know, some people might listen to jazz fusion and think, what a busy load of nonsense. Other people might listen to it and find it really stimulating. But even beyond that, the actual use of music as an object to influence the population at large. It's interesting to note how that develops based on the available technologies and the way the technologies are used to influence society at large as well. And it's interesting to see how that functions to sort of create a meaning in a non-physical space as well. So me, you, and Gerry are having a discussion via Zoom using the technology that's available. But if none of this stuff existed, and because my and Gerry's key point of interest is the music of Frank Zappa. If that stuff had never been recorded and distributed, and if this technology had never emerged, none of us would know each other even existed necessarily. So it's interesting to see the effect that it has in terms of the way the more general function of music evolves, as well as the actual language of music.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Hold on, Clinton. You can have a follow-up, but you mean you're blaming this Zoom on Frank?
Not entirely, but Zappa was an object from the outside that acted upon us.
I want to thank Frank because what you said, just really quick, because I don't want to take Clinton's time, because he should do a follow-up or one more. But Tom Waits said the best music doesn't want to be recorded. And music's just too sacred. You know, all art aspires to the condition of music. And all we've been doing is jamming. This is a great jam session. But that's a great thing, because Charlie Parker, which you brought up, is playing at Birdland, and one of his fans snuck in a record lathe, and he recorded him because he said, this guy is too good. Only his solos on a fucking record lathe in the middle of the, he's like, cutting these recordings, and he only did his solos. So in the long run, these solos eventually came out and people could study them. But the beauty is the camaraderie and the community that music causes when you celebrate as a live event. So I just wanted to make that little cut in. Go ahead, Clinton.
So if somebody invented a way to dance to jazz fusion tomorrow, and suddenly Frank Zappa and Mr. Bungle were the biggest bands being retrieved in the world, and then there was a million imitators, and they became super popular, and every club you went to was jazz fusion, and kids on TikTok doing their dances to it, would that be the best thing ever or the worst thing ever?
I don't think it'd be bad, but then once there's a saturation, it becomes boring. So it's One thing I find interesting about a lot of enthusiasts of music like Zappa or Mr. Bungle, things which tend to be a little bit niche because you don't really hear them too much on the radio and everything, as people start to become a bit protective over them. Actually, in fact, on some of my analysis videos, I'll often get people, especially the Zappa ones, I'll get people commenting saying what they thought Zappa would have thought of, how they think it should be analysed, and people get protective over it because it becomes a little facet of their identity, and they don't want it to be impeded upon. But in my objection to it becoming so popular wouldn't be that. It'd just be that you'd hear too much of it and you'd want to move on to the next thing. It'd just be saturation.
Yeah, it's a great question, Clinton, because I always said in my 50 years celebrating Frank, learning from him, enjoying him, I said if Frank ever sold out or got popular, he already sold out a million times, in the sense that Paul Schrader says that the role of the artist is to attempt to sell out but fail. And Frank has failed a million times, and he's not a miserable failure. But I would say to myself, if he ever, because we walked out of 200 Motels, the movie in 72, and go, Frank sold out. In retrospect, it's the most unsold out rock film ever made. But at that time, at that moment, we felt that that's what he did. But this whole thing of Frank being popular, I always said if Frank ever gets popular, I won't follow him anymore, because I hate the Beatles, I hate Bruce Springsteen, I hate the Beach Boys, I hate it, Steely Dan, I hate all that shit. But I appreciate it, and I know it's good, and I'll tap my foot to it. And I live in Venice, California. You can't hate the Doors. And it's illegal to hate the Doors if you live in Venice. But the point is that everybody's going to try to homogenize Frank and help people understand him. In the latest movie is sort of that attempt. Well, I'm going to humanize him with these faults that he had. And it's like they got it all wrong, but they tried hard, and all the power to them. And all the Zappa fans, are puking on the side. And the other people who don't know Zappa go, that was a great movie. And I go, great, thank you. It just spread the word. So that's a beautiful thing. This whole thing about niche is just like Frank Zappa and Finnegan's Wake will never be homogenized. It's impossible. Thank God. Same with McEwen. You know it, Clinton. It will never happen. And I mean, speaking in absolute terms is a bad thing. So we don't want to melt your time too much more. I rambled for a little, and I want to close with a question, but Clinton, if you have another one, that's fine.
Please wrap us up.
Okay, so in closing, Sam, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Here's the last question. What gives you the most optimism?
My electric blanket. I know I'm not going to go to sleep cold.
That is good, because you live in cold country, eh?
Cold country, cold flat. I mean, I'm not going to endorse the actions of Mao Zedong, but I can see why landlords pissed him off a little bit.
Well, in studying Finnegan's Wake via the main code breaker, Marshall McLuhan, we know that there's 3 types of communication word. That is spoken word, printed word, an electronic word. So, we want to thank Clinton for hooking us up with the electronic word, here of Zoom, enabled us to share this time with you. Clinton, thank you so much. And Samuel R. Howard, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thanks very much, Clinton, for assisting. It's fantastic. Really nice conversation.
Thanks, guys.
And thanks a lot, Gerry. Gerry, thanks.